Hello students, welcome to Smart English Preparation. Today I am going to show you one book that is titled A Critical History of English Literature, Volume 2. This book is written by David Digges. This book is the revised edition. This book is for those people who are preparing for a NET or SET examination or who are preparing for PH.D entrance exam. So this is volume 2. The book starts from the restoration to the present day. So as you are watching right now, the restoration. What happened in this age? The Puritan experiment in government did not long survive Cromwell's death in 1658. Less than 2 years later, in May 1660, Charles II returned from exile amid popular acclamation. The shouting and joy expressed by all is past imagination, recorded the diarist Samuel Pepys. And though, as one of those who went over to Holland to escort the king back, he cannot be considered a wholly impartial witness. There can be no doubt that a majority of the nation was weary both of the rigors of the Puritan rule and of the instability in government that followed Cromwell's death. There remained, as time was to show, a strong Puritan core in England. But for the moment, monarchist sentiment was in the ascendant, and the Cavaliers came back to enjoy an Indian summer until the bad judgment of Charles's brother and successor James II alienated finally the great Protestant heart of the country, and so brought about the glorious Revolution of 1688 and the accession of his king and queen not by divine right but on parliament's terms. There was a strong traditional element in England which had never reconciled itself to the execution of Charles I and to the various forms which Cromwell's rule book, and this was true even of many who were on the Puritan side in the conflict. The popular welcome given to Charles on his return was largely due to the general belief that continuity and legality had now been re-established without loss of any of the real gains for Protestant freedom and variety won in the fight against royal absolutism and episcopal dictatorship in the 1640s. This view proved to be unduly optimistic. If it had been well founded, the revolution of 1688 would have been unnecessary. The reaction against Puritan manners and morals was inevitable. It was all the more violent because many of the returned Cavaliers had spent their exile in France and become expert in French wit and French gallantry, and because the king himself, an indolent sensualist possessed of both wit and cunning, encouraged an atmosphere of hedonistic liveliness of court. Charles set the tone for the court wits, and the court wits set the tone, if not for all the literature of the period, at least for a certain segment of wit, notably dramatic comedy. They were themselves often poets or dramatists. They wrote, however, not as professional men of letters, but as gentlemen, amateurs writing for their own amusement. John Wilmot, Earl of Rochester, a wit and a rake of the first rank, was a skilled practitioner of the witty and polished verses, often erotic and not infrequently pornographic, and sometimes satiric. which represented the courtly literary fashion of the time of the major court wits, and they represented a definite group who flourished from about 1665 to 1680. And George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, Charles Sackville, Lord Buckhurst, Sir Charles Sedley, John Sheffield, Earl of Mulgrave, Sir Carscroft, and Rochester himself, the most poetically gifted of the wits who were noblemen, were all amateur versifiers or poets, and many were also patrons of humbler writers. Sir George Etheridge and William Wycherley, two of the most important Restoration dramatists, were also members of the court circle of wits and wrote to amuse themselves. The amoral wit and stylized hedonism, which represented the ideals in both life and letters professed by the Restoration wits, had no real roots in the larger and deeper patterns of life. At the time, the mood and tone which we think of as Restoration, and which is reflected so brilliantly in the best Restoration comedy, and was confined to London, and in London only to courtly and fashionable circles. There was no provincial culture and England which corresponded to it more than at any previous time in the history of English literature. The most characteristic Restoration literature was metropolitan. Nothing is more striking among the sentiments expressed by wits in Restoration plays than the universal praise of London and detestation of the country. In Etheridge, the man of mode, the supreme of Doryman's love for Harriet is his willingness to follow her into the country, even after Harriet has summed up all the disadvantages of country living in a speech that epitomizes the attitude of these writers to life outside London. In Restoration comedy generally, people from the country are consistently ridiculed for their uncouthness and lack of sophistication. Husbands from the country could go so far as to resent their wives, amours with city gentlemen, as in Wycherley's The Country Wife, a vulgar trait which showed no proper understanding of the Restoration attitude towards sex. That attitude is basic to the tone of Restoration high society, and it is most clearly revealed in the most characteristic literary product of the society, Restoration comedy. The influence of the returned king and circle of court wits on the literature of the period is thus most strikingly and immediately apparent in the theatre. The Puritan government had stopped the performance of plays in September 1642, and though there were occasional surreptitious performances at the various theatres after the passing of the Ordinance of Suppression, though Sir William Davenant received permission to give some private dramatic performances and perhaps and also some more public performances in the late 1650s. On the whole, it can be said that the English theatre did not exist between 1642 and 1660. With the restoration of King Charles came the restoration of the theatre, but it was a different theatre playing to a different kind of audience from that which had called forth the plays of Shakespeare. The modern theatre, with its picture frame stage, its actresses taking female parts, its movable scenery designed to create a visual image of the local of each scene, its artificial light was developed during this period. This was partly because of the influence of France, where so many of Charles's hangers on had spent their exile, and partly because the Restoration Theatre took over and developed the traditions of the private rather than the public Elizabethan and Jacobean theatre, which had in some degree managed to survive the prohibition of public dramatic performances. The audience for Restoration drama was also more restricted, both geographically and socially, than it had been before the closing of the theatres. There was no dramatic activity of any consequence outside London, and the two theatres within the metropolis catered to wits and gallants who went to the play as much for the purpose. Then what happened? There was no dramatic activity of any consequence outside London. The playhouse was regarded by the respectable citizens of London as a centre of vice and exhibitionism, and they accordingly avoided it, while the dramatists in their turn took every opportunity in ridiculing the middle class virtues, and as often as not presented the citizenry as made up of foolish and jealous husbands, whose wives were fair game and seduction by coarse glands.